Well, hello. This is Bob Odell with RootSource, and I am so pleased today to be with a woman who has had such a profound role in the formation of RootSource. I would like to introduce you to my friend, Christine Darg. Hi, Christine.
Bob, it's so wonderful to be with you here today. I'm very excited about the conversation that we're having.
You know, we have talked about doing this interview for, I think, years.
Yes.
But you're going all over the place. Here we are in Israel and Jerusalem at the moment, but you just travel the world, don't you?
Yes, well, of course, as you know, this is the mandate of our ministry. The mandate is Acts 1:8, but you shall receive power, dunamis power, when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses, beginning in Jerusalem, where we are today, but then fanning out to biblical Judea and Samaria, as that verse goes, yes. And then to the uttermost parts of the earth. So every month, as we're here in Jerusalem, we go off somewhere under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to the ends of the earth. So it's hard for us always to meet up, because I know you're on the run for the Lord too.
Yes, I do that sometimes, I guess. The name Christine Darg is first associated with your husband Peter.
Yes.
And we also hear your name associated with two different terms. One is Jerusalem Channel and one is Exploits. Can you tell us what is the difference between those two?
Well, Exploits Ministry was the name that my husband gave to our ministry many years ago, because we were doing Bible works in the Bible lands. And my husband said, you know, what you're doing is exploits. Now, that's a King James term that was put into the Bible from Daniel 11:32, where in that verse it says that the people who know God will be strong, Bob, not weak, right?
Yes, yes.
And we will do exploits, so the King James Bible says. But in the Hebrew Scriptures, it just says that we'll be strong and do. In other words, we'll do the works of the Lord. So for many years, we've been going throughout Israel and the Bible lands, preaching the gospel, sharing about the Isaiah 19 highway that's coming into formation in the last days. But then, because we're also broadcasters, the Lord brought about our television ministry. It evolved into the Jerusalem Channel. Okay. So JerusalemChannel.tv is part of Exploits Ministry, and Exploits is part of the Jerusalem Channel. And we're so happy, by the way, and we want to thank you that many of your RootSource videos appear under our channel at Jerusalem Channel, because we have multiple channels under Hebrew Roots. Thank you so much.
And that stems from the relationship that you have forged with Gedon Ariel, which we want to get into. But that was Gedon's thought that we could share resources and videos that way. So we're appreciative to you to get some of our material out to a larger audience. We're here in Jerusalem. I'd like to hear, first of all, the essence of the story of how you first came to Israel. How did God call you to Israel?
God gave me a love, Bob, for the Jewish people and for Israel, literally from my crib. Because when I was born to a wonderful mother and father. My father was in seminary in the American state of Georgia. And while he was in seminary there, I was a very sickly child. And one of my earliest childhood memories was being in my baby crib, because I remember the wooden slats. And the Lord appeared to me, Jesus appeared to me and healed me of a hole in my heart, a rheumatic fever. My parents said I was very sickly and I could have died. And when he appeared to me, Bob, guess what? He didn't look like the Gentile Jesus on my Sunday school walls from day dot, from the beginning. But he appeared as a Sabra, a native-born Israeli, as the King of the Jews, very Middle Eastern, Sephardic Jesus. And he said, I've come to heal you. And so I've seen the Lord, and because my father, being a conservative, evangelical Presbyterian minister, had a reverence for the Jewish people, and because he didn't teach so-called replacement theology,
Yes.
he imparted to me from my infancy, really from being an infant, the love of the Jewish people. And so I was always concerned about them. And then as I grew up, I got very involved as a journalist in the journalistic world. I was a very high-paid reporter, by the grace of God, on the eastern coast of the United States, and was a very ambitious reporter and editor and all of these things. But after I married my husband, who's also a journalist and a broadcaster, what I call a divine discontent came upon me. And we had gone on a trip around the world, and I had seen the nations and fallen in love with the nations, and I wanted to spend the rest of my life sharing the gospel, but also understanding God's end-time role for Israel. I got fascinated with end-time prophecy. And so we said, Lord, help us to get to the Middle East to explain what you're doing in the last days as journalists. And by the grace of God, at that time, the Christian Broadcasting Network, 700 Club, under Pat Robertson, sent us out here to start their first news bureau and to help run this gift that God gave to us, Middle East television. So we were involved in the first Christian gospel outreach, doing the news for it, in the history of the Lord's work in these last days. And we said, God, give us this opportunity to have a part in your end-time plan. And he so graciously has done that by bringing us into relationship with Israel and with his people.
Now, when you came to Israel, well, first of all, I think our viewers ought to understand that this Middle East TV, back in the 80s, there were like 3 TV channels in Israel, and this was one of them. So a lot of people got their news from Middle East TV, right?
Yes.
So.
And it was amazing how the 700 Club was shown every day. The gospel was preached. And it was part of God's plan to help bring Jews and Christians together.
Yes.
It was a wonderful faith-based diplomacy work, I believe.
You've told me in the past about a word that the Lord gave you when you came to Israel early on. There was a word that appeared in front of you, and that word jarred you and took you in a certain direction. Can you tell us that story?
Yes, I think this is an edifying story because it helps us to understand how the Lord leads somebody, especially when he's calling us into a ministry and calling us to support Israel. The call to start broadcasting here was contested, as you can imagine. There was a lot of spiritual warfare involved around it. So my husband and I had to get involved in prayer and fasting in order to see the call come to fruition. And so while this fast was going on, a fast, as you know, makes you more susceptible to hearing from the Holy Spirit. We already knew we were called here through many, many signs of calling. But during this fast, I had a prophetic dream, what I call an epic prophetic dream, one that you know is from God and you'll never forget. And in this dream, I'm standing on Mount Zion, and I see the Shekinah glory of God in the dream. But behind the Shekinah glory are the nations. And the nations are becoming angrier and angrier against Jerusalem, against Israel. And remember, this was back in the 1980s when the amount of animosity against Israel had grown so much. Yes. But the Lord showed me what the prophecies say, that all nations will come against Jerusalem and Israel. But I heard a voice from the Shekinah say, because they were coming angry against me, do not harm my servant, for she must stand with Israel when all the nations of the world turn against Israel. And then the next thing I saw in that dream was a column, a pillar come up from the earth with the word hegemony on it. And I didn't know what the word meant, Bob. I had to go to the dictionary. And many times the Lord speaks to us this way. Yes. In dreams, he'll give me a word. I'll have to look up the word in the dictionary. And of course, that word, hegemonious spirit, means a spirit that wants to take over all of the land. And so the Lord was showing me that our ministry would be fought and Israel would be fought by a hegemonious spirit that wants to usurp all of the land that God, by covenant, has given to his people. And this is what we're seeing going on right now. It's happening now. But we know the end of the story.
We do. We do know the end. Now, your path here in Israel took a turn at one point to where you've talked about this, where God led you to turn your focus towards the Muslim world. How did that happen, and what did that look like?
Isn't it amazing, the ways of God? His ways are past finding out. Because all my life, I have loved the Jewish people. I grew up with a lot of Jewish friends. And when we came here, I thought, wow, we have arrived, like so many naive believers do, really, to think, I'm here to save Israel. You know, how many have to, I mean, not that we think we could, but we hope that we're going to be a part in this great and glorious salvation that the Apostle Paul longed to see. And he said he had a continual sorrow in his heart for his brethren, the Jewish people. And so if you are a Bible believer, and you believe not just in the New Testament, but you believe in the Hebrew Scriptures, then with all of your heart and soul, you want to see the salvation of Israel and somehow have a little part in it. Well, when we arrived, I mean, the Jewish people had still just stepped out of the Holocaust. And the last thing they want to be is proselytized or evangelized. They need a friend. They need someone to come alongside of them and say, we're going to help you see all of these Bible prophecies fulfilled. Because the scriptures say the Gentiles will be involved in helping this to come about. But here I am with all this evangelistic fervor. And one night, when we were producing our nightly news show here in Jerusalem, as I was driving from where we lived in Mevaseret Zion, going up to the studio, on that beautiful Tel Aviv to Jerusalem highway at twilight, when you look over at the cities on the hill, and it looks like the New Jerusalem come down, there's a supernatural element. Well, right at the junction where it's believed that the Lord appeared to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, the Holy Spirit got into my car and was sitting in the passenger seat as I'm driving up to Jerusalem.
You're alone in the car.
I'm alone in the car. My husband was already in the studio. I had gotten our two sons put to bed. We had two young sons here, and they were being taken care of at home, and now I'm on my way, and the Holy Spirit is in the passenger seat as I'm driving, and he reaches over and touches me in the forehead. That night, I had been invited to hold my first evangelistic meeting in a home in Bethlehem amongst the Arabs. Well, as I did the news that night, our Israeli cameraman said, Christine, there's something different about you tonight. I don't know what it is. Well, when I went to the meeting in Bethlehem, there were, these people are tribal. It was a house meeting, but there were about 40 or 50 people in there. They asked me to share the gospel. They asked me to pray for the sick. Do you know, Bob, every person there said they wanted to receive Jesus. The healings that took place, I had never seen such healings take place. And I received a revelation. Now, years later, my husband and I worked with evangelist Reinhard Bonnke, the great evangelist in Germany, and he had up to 1 million people. And he used to always say, God never wastes a harvest. And that night I got a revelation. It's the time of the harvest of the Arabs. And so I had always loved the Jews, and I didn't know anything about the Arabs, but God gave me a supernatural love for them. And then I started moving amongst the Arabs and evangelizing, and we saw that the Holy Spirit is moving in dreams and visions. I wrote a book about it. I wrote really the first book about this phenomenon, and that's how you and I met.
Well, I want to ask you about that when we return. I think we've got a lot more interesting topics to cover, but that's where we'll pick back up when we return. So please stay with us, and until next time, this is Bob Odell from Root Source saying Shalom.